and welcome back to another video on my channel. So lately I have been avoiding doing true crime cases just because of all of the craziness that has been going on in the world. I feel like diving too deeply into a true crime case isn't good for anybody's mental health right now because there's already so much tragedy happening just absolutely everywhere all around us. But for some reason this week I have taken a particular interest in a little bit of true crime cases that also have a bit of something else in them. So on Monday, obviously, if you saw that video, you know what that one was all about. And this one today is kind of a mix between an urban legend and a real life true crime case. So with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. Today's video was inspired by a documentary that was released in 2009, which is called Cropsey. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have seen the documentary, but I personally watched it, I think when it first came out, or maybe a few years after it came out. But whenever I did watch it, it was several years ago, and I did really enjoy it, but I haven't really thought about the case ever since. But for some reason, while I was trying to think of a topic to talk about in today's video, that is the first thing that popped up in my mind, and I thought that this would be great content because, again, this is a mixture between an urban legend and a true crime case. And I don't really talk about that many urban legends on my channel, but I would like to incorporate them a little bit more often because I do think that they are very interesting, especially when there is some truth to them. So anyways, today we are going to be talking about the urban legend known as Cropsey. Both of the topics that we are going to be talking about in today's video take place on Staten Island, which is located in New York. Staten Island, however, is not like the rest of New York, and it is not what you think of when you think of New York. It is an island. I do believe that you have to take a ferry or some kind of boat to get from New York to Staten Island. But this island isn't hustle and bustle, big city living like the rest of New York. It's much more laid back. There's a lot of hiking trails and gardens. And I do want to say that it's a much more like residential vibe rather than the big city living that New York really is. But anyways, this is where the legend of Cropsey came from, which is again Staten Island. There is a building located on this island that was once known as Seaview Hospital, and that was a tuberculosis sanitarium. And just like normal hospitals, this hospital had tunnels running underneath the ground, and being abandoned, obviously something that comes from all abandoned buildings, but especially abandoned psych wards, hospitals, things like that. A lot of stories had come out of this because that is very creepy. There's this big building where people could have possibly died and all of that kind of stuff, and it's completely abandoned. And so obviously, just like in every small town that has a big building like that, a story or an urban legend kind of came along that included this big, very large abandoned hospital. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the urban legend of Cropsey right now. So Cropsey is an urban legend that was kind of passed on between kid to kid. Some of the parents also passed this on to their older children, who would kind of pass the story on to the younger children, and nobody ever really debunked this or told their kids it wasn't true, because this was kind of a method of how to kind of scare the kids to doing exactly what the parents wanted. The kids were scared that this was actually real, and so in order to kind of keep them in check, the parents would tell them this, and then the kids wouldn't sneak out at night, or they would avoid going to dark places and dangerous places alone. Just things like that to kind of scare the kids into listening. So Cropsey is said to be an escaped mental patient who has homicidal tendencies. He also has lost his hand, and so in place of one of his hands, he has a very large hook. Cropsey is said to only really come out at night, and he mainly preys on children. After Cropsey had picked his victims, he would then capture them by sticking his hook through their body and dragging them back to those very dark, creepy tunnels located underneath the Seaview Hospital. And once he had his victims down there, nobody knows what he would do to them, but these victims would allegedly never be seen again. So as you can see, this legend of Cropsey is just like a normal urban legend that floats around small towns or even cities amongst teenagers and other children just to kind of creep each other out. And this legend of Cropsey sounds awfully familiar to another kind of urban legend that floats around most towns, I think, because This kind of one that I'm about to talk about is one that I heard growing up. When I mentioned this to my mom, she said that she had heard it growing up. Everybody who I kind of mentioned this to said that they heard some different variation of this urban legend growing up, but there are several different variations of this urban legend that I'm about to talk about next. So the way that this story kind of goes is that there are two teenagers, a boy and a girl, and they're going out on a date when they decide to park their vehicle at a lover's lane type area. Once they get to this area and they park the vehicle, they turn on the radio, and that is when they hear a warning about an escaped mental patient who is very dangerous. He has homicidal tendencies, he's just an absolute lunatic, and the only way that you can identify this man is because he has a hook for a hand. Now, in this kind of urban legend story, the girl gets nervous and the boy tries to kind of comfort her, and they end up either staying at the area, and then they hear knocking on the car door, and the boy tries to be a hero and gets out of the car, and they both end up getting murdered by this lunatic. Or another variation of the story is that they're sitting in the car, they hear tapping on the outside of the car, the girl starts freaking out, she insists that they leave, they drive home, and that is when they find a hook sticking out of the handle of the car door. But again, there are several different variations of this urban legend. They all kind of include an escaped mental patient with a hook for a hand, but they all kind of end a little bit differently. I've definitely heard several different variations of this story myself growing up, but it is one that I think most, if not all of us, are quite familiar with and have heard at least one time in our lives. And really, that's all everybody thought that the legend of Cropsey was. It was just a different variation on a teenage horror story that was floating around Staten Island. Obviously, again, having a very large abandoned building in the area, it would seem that the horror story kind of built and formed around that, which I think probably happens quite often, especially because hospitals being abandoned, again, are a very creepy thing. People pass away in there. There's like a lot of things that go on in a hospital that it being completely empty would just leave you feeling a little bit unsettled. So the fact that an urban legend had formed around the abandoned hospital didn't seem all that strange. But what makes this horror story different from other horror stories that may be floating around your town or my town about this hooked maniac who is killing kids in their car at Lover's Lane is there is a little bit of truth to this urban legend. And that is why I said that today's video would be a mix between an urban legend and a true crime case, because there's a true crime case that strikes a lot of similarities to the urban legend of Cropsey. The legend of Cropsey may seem too horrifying to hold any truth to it, but in the 1970s, the residents of Staten Island would experience their very own real-life horror of a lunatic man running around the island preying on small children, just like in the island's urban legend of Cropsey. I'm going to get into the true crime kind of part of this video that kind of links it all together, but before we do so, if you have been on my channel for a while, then you already know that I have a very, very difficult time pronouncing certain words, especially ones that are not English. And a lot of these last names that I'm going to talk about are quite complicated to pronounce. So if I do say any of them wrong, I profusely apologize. I am doing my best. I looked up some of them on Google, but because they are names, there isn't really a lot of pronunciation guidelines to follow. So if I do pronounce any of the last names in this next part of the video wrong, I do apologize for that. The man, it is said that Andre Rand didn't really have a very bad upbringing. There was nothing significantly wrong with his childhood until 1958, when his father sadly passed away. And quickly after his father passed away, his mother was institutionalized, and that was, I believe, when Andre was about 14 years old. However, I couldn't find very much information as to why his mother was institutionalized, but what I did find was that Andre and his sister were pretty much just completely left alone to fend for themselves. But again, there wasn't really too much information that I could find about what went on during this time, so we're going to kind of jump forward now to the mid-1960s. At this time, Andre was working as a janitor at the Willowbrook State School, which was a school for children with mental disabilities. And I do believe that Andre worked there for quite a while, eventually making his way up to being someone quite important in that school kind of dynamic. However, there was a documentary released about the Willowbrook State School that kind of paints all of the very twisted and sick and horrific things that took place within this school. And so because of that reason, there was a documentary made about this, like I just said, and the school got shut down. Now, I don't believe that any of these allegations were specifically against Andre, but he did work there, which I thought was pretty interesting. There isn't really much I can say about Willowbrook State School right now in this video, but there is a lot of sick and twisted things that took place within that school, so much so that that could be an entire video on its own, honestly. The first crime that Andre had ever served jail time for is actually a pretty weird one. He somehow got his hands on a school bus and he drove around and went to the YMCA that is located on Staten Island, and he picked up 11 children. He took these 11 children and fed them, and then he took them to the New Jersey airport. This was all without any permission from any of the children's parents or anything like that, and luckily he was caught and the children were all returned safely back to their parents, and none of them were harmed during this very weird abduction. But Andre did end up serving time for this because he did ultimately abduct those 11 children. However, I just think that that whole entire abduction thing is quite strange. And then on May 25th, 1969, Andre would commit a much more heinous crime. He had abducted a young girl and she was only 9 years old, and after he abducted her, he went on to attempt to sexually assault her. But luckily the girl was found and rescued before this could happen, but Andre ended up serving 16 months in prison for the abduction and the attempted sexual assault of this 9-year-old girl. And then in 1972, a 5-year-old girl by the name of Alice Pereira vanished from her apartment building lobby located on Staten Island. She had been in the lobby playing with her brother, and her brother had left her alone for no more than a couple minutes, and when he returned, his sister was nowhere to be found. After their mother had reported Alice missing, many reports came in of people claiming to have seen Alice in local parks all over Staten Island that were pretty close to her apartment building, but nothing ever came of any of these leads, and Alice was never seen again. Because of Andre's history and the timeline of when this child going missing had taken place, he had just gotten out of jail, so Andre quickly became the main suspect in this case. However, there was no evidence to link him to this case, there was no sightings or anything like that, and so there was nothing to really convict him for, and so Andre stayed a free man at this point. In 1981, a 7-year-old girl by the name of Holly Ann Hughes walked to a local store with one of her friends to buy a bar of soap, but she never returned home. Once her mother had reported her missing to authorities, the girl's young friend was questioned by police, and she said that her friend Holly was pulled into a Volkswagen van by a man who fitted the description of Andre. After this report came in, many other people started calling into the local police station saying that they had spotted Holly Hughes with a man fitting Andre Rand's description. Police quickly did try to track down Andre, but sadly, Holly Ann Hughes was also never seen again. 2 years would pass, and then in 1983, an 11-year-old girl by the name of Tia Hias Jackson went to the store to buy food for her mother, and she never came home. She was last seen on August 14th in a local motel, and many people claimed that they had seen her with Andre, and he quickly became the main suspect in this case as well, but there was again no solid evidence to link him to this young woman's disappearance. Now at this point in the case, we are going on to somebody much older. The year was 1984, and 22-year-old Hank Gaffaro, who was described as being a little bit slower and having a very low IQ, was last seen in the early hours of the morning in a local diner sitting and eating with Andre Rand. Unfortunately, Hank had never returned home, and again, Andre was the main suspect in this case, but at the time he could not be linked to the case by any evidence or anything like that, and so he also ended up walking free for this case at that time. And then in 1987, Jennifer Seeger would go missing after she was last seen on a walk through a park with Andre Rand. Her case would help solve the rest of these cases and be able to link the rest of these cases to Andre after her body was found in a shallow grave located on the Willowbrook State School property. At this time, the school had been completely abandoned, and it still remains abandoned to this day, and after searching the property, that is when police were able to find very close to the body was Andre's pretty much like makeshift campsite where he had been living. The following year in 1988, Andre Rand was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. However, the jury could not reach a verdict on the murder charge for reasons that we will talk about in just a second. But he was convicted on the first-degree kidnapping charge, and Andre was sentenced to 25 years to life and would be eligible for parole in 2008, but was convicted of a second kidnapping, so he was no longer eligible. So let's talk about the reason why the jury could not agree on a murder charge for Andre. So this would be because many people who were involved in this case, as well as the jury and several detectives, thought that Andre could have very possibly been a part of some satanic group, and he was providing the children to a second group of people who were using these children as sacrifices. This theory goes along with the theory that Andre was not working alone in these murders. Many people believe that Andre was kidnapping these children and then passing them around in the mentally disabled and homeless community of people who were living in the tunnels underneath the abandoned Willowbrook State Hospital. In 2004, Andre Rand was tried for the kidnapping of Holly Ann Hughes, and he was convicted of this kidnapping in October of that year. He was sentenced to serve another 25 years to life and will be eligible for parole in the year 2037 when he will be 93 years old. My heart sincerely goes out to all of the victims and the loved ones of the victims who were affected by Andre Rand. This case is absolutely sickening. Any kind of murder case is absolutely sickening, but those that prey on children and people who can't fend for themselves, there's just something about those specific cases that are just that much more horrible, and they really, really get under your skin, and this entire thing is just so sickening. And I don't think that Andre will ever get out of jail because his crimes were so heinous. But again, my heart sincerely goes out to anybody who was affected by this case. The similarities between Andre Rand and the legend of Cropsey do appear to be strikingly similar, and although Andre Rand may not be a hook-wielding maniac who drags his victims down to the Seaview Hospital by stabbing them with his hook, his crimes seem to be much more horrifying and horrendous than even ones that could be created by somebody's mind, although the legend of Cropsey does seem to be roughly based on the true crime case of Andre Rand. But guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you would like more information on today's topic, I highly recommend that you go check out the 2009 documentary called Cropsey. And if you like this video, it would mean a lot to me if you could give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!